Planet America's fake news.
What the hell is going on here?
Welcome to Planet America. Hello, I'm John Barron.
And I'm Chaz Gidello.
This week, following the arrest of Julian Assange, we'll speak to a Clinton advisor whose hacked emails he leaked.
I find it really hard to believe he did not know his intermediary were Russian actors.
Meanwhile, the Mueller report is due within days, and Attorney General Bill Barr says Trump's campaign was being spied on by Americans.
Also this week, I'll take a deep dive into the long, sorry saga of Venezuela. How did a country with so much oil wealth go so wrong?
Sanctions are being used directly and intentionally to deprive Venezuelan people, regardless of their political affiliation. It is financial terrorism.
And with Joe Biden expected to announce his presidential plans any day, I'll look at his long, controversial and at times tragic life in the public eye.
But you know what's first? This graphic!
First to the news that US authorities are seeking the extradition of Wikileaks founder Julian Assange for allegedly conspiring to hack into the Defence Department's computer network in 2010. Assange, who spent almost 7 years inside the Ecuadorian embassy in London before his arrest this week, allegedly conspired with former intelligence analyst Chelsea Manning to attempt to log in anonymously. Manning had already accessed hundreds of thousands of sensitive military and diplomatic documents and was convicted of leaking them to Assange, who posted them online. US authorities now have 60 days to add any further charges to the extradition request, which could relate to Assange's role in publishing hacked emails damaging Hillary Clinton in 2016. This is what President Trump said about Wikileaks then.
Wikileaks! I love Wikileaks.
Oh, we love Wikileaks. Boy, they have really Wikileaks.
But here's what he said today.
Do you still love Wikileaks?
I know nothing about Wikileaks. It's not my thing. And I know there is something having to do with Julian Assange. I've been seeing what's happened with Assange, and that will be a determination, I would imagine, mostly by the Attorney General.
And we'll be speaking to Neera Tanden, whose emails were among those that Wikileaks posted online shortly, Chairs.
Now, John, I'm of the view that either all the press is free or none of the press is free. I'm also of the view that a free press requires no character reference, so it's not relevant whether Julian Assange is a great bloke or not. But at least so far, this arrest has got nothing to do with press freedom. It's got nothing to do with what Assange has published. He's been indicted for conspiracy to commit computer intrusion. Now, that's a legitimate crime. My only question is, are they throwing a book at him Al Capone style for this little crime to get him for his publishing? At this point, we simply don't know.
I think we kind of do.
Well, I hope not.
US Attorney General Bill Barr says that he hopes to release a redacted version of the Mueller report within days. General Barr appeared this week before the House Appropriations Committee and was asked about media reports that surfaced last week claiming some members of the special counsel's team were unhappy with the way Barr's 4-page summary characterised Mueller's findings, believing the full report is much more damaging to the president.
I felt that I should state the bottom line conclusions, and I tried to use Special Counsel Mueller's own language in doing that.
Barr says that he offered to let Mueller review his letter to Congress summarising the report's findings before sending it on March 24th, but that the special counsel declined. However, the Attorney General refused to say whether anyone at the White House saw a copy of the full report before his letter was sent or subsequently.
I've already laid out the process that is going forward to release these reports, hopefully within a week. And I'm not going to say anything more about it until the report is out and everyone has a chance to look at it.
Just on those media reports about what Mueller's investigations think, I wouldn't necessarily treat them as gospel.
Really?
Yeah, no, I wouldn't. The first reports were published in the New York Times, and they said that Mueller's investigators have told associates about their frustrations, according to government officials and others. So the source isn't Mueller's team or even their associates, but government officials who'd heard stuff. And the sources in the Washington Post article and the NBC article afterwards were also government officials, so they could potentially be the same third-hand sources. Now, I'm not saying the story's not true, I'd just be a little bit wary.
Very wise counsel there. We'll know soon enough. Meanwhile, Bill Barr has made further headlines this week when he was asked in a Senate hearing about the President's request the Justice Department look at any surveillance of the 2016 Trump campaign by US agencies.
I'm not talking about the FBI necessarily, but intelligence agencies more broadly.
So you're not suggesting, though, that spying occurred?
I think spying did occur. Yes, I think spying did occur.
Well, Barr also noted changes to laws around the collection of intelligence about domestic political figures had changed since the Vietnam era, and he said that he didn't know whether any of the surveillance or spying was illegal. Democratic House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, though, says that Barr's spying comments show he is failing at his job.
Let me just say how very, very dismaying and disappointing that the chief law enforcement officer of our country is going off the rails.
Yeah, if you call surveillance spying, then yeah, everyone agrees it happened. Surveillance happened. It's just a question of whether the surveillance was legitimate or not. I think the word spying's been beaten up a bit, to be honest. But the Democrats are certainly getting nervous about Bill Barr. I don't think anyone's forgotten that when Bill Barr was last Attorney General in the 90s, he advised George H.W. Bush to pardon 6 officials for crimes in the Iran-Contra scandal, which effectively killed the special counsel's investigation and therefore executed a massive cover-up. It seems especially relevant, seeing as this week Bill Barr received the perfect excuse to censor grand jury info from the Mueller report. It's a fresh ruling from the DC Circuit that states judges have no authority to authorise grand jury revelations outside the privacy-protecting Rule 6E, and that Rule 6E does not contain an exception that would permit disclosure to Congress. In other words, if the Democrats take Bill Barr to court for excessive secrecy, they're probably going to lose. Mind you, Trump supporters aren't taking any chances. Check out this spin from Congressman Devin Nunes, just in case the Mueller report gets a bit feisty.
I think people should be very leery of only receiving what I call the Mueller dossier. Partisans wrote this document.
Dear, the Mueller dossier.
People are calling it the Mueller dossier. Meanwhile, Secretary for Homeland Security Kirstjen Nielsen was asked to resign by the President this week, and she obliged. Confirmation of Nielsen's departure came in the now customary form of a tweet. The President then announced that Customs and Border Protection Commissioner Kevin McAleenan will become the acting DHS Secretary. According to the New York Times, the President was determined to get rid of Nielsen after asking her to close ports of entry along the border and stop accepting asylum seekers altogether. She resisted because she found the measures, quote, ineffective and inappropriate.
Not to mention completely illegal.
Yeah, right. Well, the bottom line is that Nielsen just wasn't tough enough for President Trump, and after her departure was confirmed, the President was back on Twitter.
Mexico must apprehend all illegals and not let them make the long march up to the United States, or we will have no other choice than to close the border and or institute tariffs. Our country is full.
Well, that revolving door has been a spinning. McAleenan joins other senior acting members of this administration now, including the acting Defence Secretary, Patrick Shanahan, David Bernhardt, acting at Interior, White House Chief of Staff, acting, Mick Mulvaney. He's still just acting in that role, although he could be made permanent, doesn't need confirmation. Plus, there's an acting ambassador to the UN, the Budget Management Authority, the FAA, Safety and Health, Food and Drug Administration, and a total of 5 other administrations, including Tex Ailes at the Secret Service, who has just been sacked as well. Now, the reason for having so many acting members of the Trump administration is simple, like the acting ICE chief, Ron Vitiello, who announced that he would be leaving yesterday. They're all easier to hire and easier to fire. The President explained himself in February.
I like acting because I can move so quickly. Gives me more flexibility. But actually, some of the names you mentioned, they're doing a fantastic job.
The problem is these acting heads are also easier to ignore if you're the bureaucracy, so they get less done. Anyway, for those keeping count, Nielsen was the 15th cabinet member to resign under Trump, placing him well ahead of the last 3 presidents for cabinet sackings, even at the end of their first terms. Also, it was interesting to see Trump trying this new talking point about America being full because it's not. Just this week, this chart was in the news. Look at all the purple. They're the counties that have less working age adults now than they did 10 years ago. 80% of American counties have less working age adults. That is what decline looks like. And by the way, Trump knows America needs more people because just this week he approved another 30,000 H-2B work visas for the summer. That is 96,000 H-2B work visas in total for this fiscal year. So clearly Trump doesn't think America is full. But that doesn't mean he shouldn't be freaking out about all the border crossings lately. These are the interceptions on the southwest border for the last 6 years. Note the green line was Obama's worst year. Now the red line is the number of interceptions this year, nearly twice as much. And by the way, note that the interceptions tend to peak around May. So it's probably going to get worse. And if we look at those interceptions over 20 years, you can see America is now back to where it was in 2007 and 2008. And who knows where it will end. Because it's not like Trump hasn't been trying stuff. He tried sending asylum seekers home immediately and was blocked by the courts. Then he tried skipping judicial review, blocked. And then he tried a whole bunch of other ideas, blocked, blocked, blocked. And then this week, the Remain in Mexico policy, which sought to keep asylum seekers working in Mexico until their court cases came up, which I thought was a good idea, has also been blocked by a court as well. So you can understand why Trump would be getting a little bit frustrated. But one more thing about Kirstjen Nielsen, John.
Yes.
Homeland Security is a big department. It keeps America safe from terrorism, cyber threats, emergencies, crime, all kinds of stuff. Kirstjen Nielsen's expertise was in security, not immigration. And I hope that Trump's Ahab-like obsession with immigration isn't causing him to ignore the rest of Homeland Security. Because if Homeland Security goes wrong, it really goes wrong.
This incredibly long and expensive election campaign leading to the statistically likely re-election of President Trump 2020.
Well, the Democrats running to be their party's 2020 presidential nominee have been announcing their first quarter fundraising tallies. And top of the list, Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders, who raked in an impressive $18 million from 900,000 individual donors, although the campaign may now be regretting setting a public target of 1 million donors and then failing to match the expectations they set. Fellow Senator Kamala Harris raised $12 million for the first quarter, followed by Beto O'Rourke, who was only in the race for 18 days, but still scooped up over $9 million. Then the surprise packet, Mayor Pete Buttigieg of South Bend, Indiana, backed up his rising poll numbers with a solid $7 million raised, the fourth highest earner. Next on the list, Senator Elizabeth Warren, who has shunned large fundraising events and paid the price. She's raised $6 million for the quarter. Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota, $5.2 million, just ahead of Senator Cory Booker, who gathered in $5.1 million. Then long-shot businessman Andrew Yang, who announced that he had raised $1.7 million for the first fiscal quarter. And Chaz, the other candidates have until Monday US time to report their fundraising. But by comparison, if you go back to 2015, Hillary Clinton raised a whopping $46 million in the first quarter of her primary race. Sanders gathered in $15 million. That was actually quarter two of 2015 because they started a little later that time around.
One pollie who's just starting to raise money is the new candidate, Tim Ryan. He put out this photo this week with a fundraiser and it looks lovely until you take a closer look at that dog who required 4 hands to restrain it, including a hand over its mouth and another hand shoving a jar of peanut butter in its face. I think Ryan might be struggling for the dog vote, John.
I think maybe the peanut butter made the dog a bit excited, actually. Now, we have been keeping a close eye on the polls to see if there's been any impact from those multiple complaints by women who say that former Vice President Joe Biden made them feel uncomfortable by kissing or hugging them inappropriately. Biden is down just 1 point overall in this week's Morning Consult poll, although his favourability rating is down 2, and his unfavourables have crept up 4, but still looking pretty solid. Asked specifically about the allegations, half of Democrats said that the Biden claims would make no difference to them. 29% said it would make them less likely to vote for Biden, and 14% said it would make them much less likely to support the former VP. Biden, though, leads Bernie Sanders by 9 points this week. Sanders has slipped 2 points. Kamala Harris is up 1 and remains in 3rd place overall, just in front of Beto O'Rourke. Then Senator Elizabeth Warren. Pete Buttigieg is moving on up, ahead of Cory Booker, Amy Klobuchar and Kirsten Gillibrand. Then come the 1%ers, including Tim Ryan, who jumped into the race last week, and then yada, 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 yada. Who knows?
It's interesting looking at those polls, John. As you say, Biden's holding on well despite making a very curious joke choice the day after his not quite apology last week.
I just want you to know I had permission to hug Lonnie.
Biden's first accuser, Lucy Flores, was not amused, tweeting that to make light of something as serious as consent degrades the conversation. Now, Biden received a lot of criticism for a while there, and yet it all seemed to make no difference. Maybe this is why. When asked whether Biden's handsiness was disqualifying, twice as many millennials said yes than the seniors did. And twice as many seniors said no than the millennials did. So this is an issue that seniors don't seem to care about. Now look at the Quinnipiac results from 2 weeks ago, broken down by age. Amongst 18 to 49-year-olds, Bernie Sanders is beating Biden by 4 points. But amongst over 50-year-olds, Biden is destroying Sanders by 25 points. It's complete domination. And there are a lot of 50-plus voters out there. That there is why Biden is in the lead, and that's also why it seems he can whisper in as many ears as he likes.
Probably tells us why Trump was elected as well. The signs are pretty clear that Vice President Biden will officially enter the 2020 race in the next week or two. Biden's age and almost half a century of political experience and baggage are certain to provide plenty of fodder for his rival Democrats and, if he is eventually the nominee, President Trump. Joe Biden's 5-decade political career has been marked by controversy and tragedy. Biden was in his 20s in 1972 when he won an upset election victory to become Senator from Delaware. 5 weeks later, his wife Nelia and their 3 young children, Beau, Hunter and Naomi, had just bought a Christmas tree when their family station wagon was sideswiped by a tractor-trailer. His wife and daughter were killed instantly. His boys were badly hurt, but survived.
Hello, Mr. President. How are you? Senator, I know this is a very tragic day for you, but I wanted you to know that all of us here at the White House were thinking about you and praying for you and also for your 2 children. I'm sure that she'll be watching you from now on. Good luck to you. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Okay.
Biden considered resigning from the Senate to take care of his sons, but he was talked into staying in politics. And by 1987, Joe Biden had rebuilt his life. He'd remarried and established himself as a forceful presence in the Senate. Now, in his mid-40s, with the Reagan era coming to an end, Joe Biden wanted to take a shot at the presidency of the United States. And his campaign started strongly, outraising his rivals and building in the polls. But then, giving his closing statement in a candidate debate at the Iowa State Fair in August 1987, Joe Biden said these fateful words.
And I started thinking as I was coming over here, why is it that Joe Biden is the first in his family ever to go to a university?
It was inspiring stuff. In fact, British Labour leader Neil Kinnock had inspired people with pretty much the same story about his family earlier that year.
Why am I the first Kinnock in 1,000 generations to be able to get to university?
And the similarities didn't end there.
Is it because they didn't work hard? My ancestors who worked in the coal mines in northeast Pennsylvania and would come up after 12 hours and play football for 4 hours?
Was it because they were weak? Those people who could work 8 hours underground and then come up and play football? Weak?
Biden had recounted the story and attributed it to Neil Kinnock dozens of times on the campaign trail, just not in that televised debate. And soon, reporters noticed it wasn't just Kinnock that Biden was borrowing from, with or without attribution.
That our generation of Americans will pay any price, bear any burden, accept any challenge, and meet any hardship.
That was from JFK's inaugural address.
And Biden says, not to worry. He reassured his staff. He said, we have nothing to fear but fear itself.
And as reporters kept digging, they discovered as a law student in the 60s, Biden had been failed for plagiarism.
He quoted 5 pages of someone else's work without proper citation. He was given an F.
Biden said at the time he didn't understand academic quoting and footnotes, but voters started to question Biden's qualifications, and he didn't take that well.
What law school did you attend, and where did you place in that class? And the other question is, could you quickly, I think
I probably have a much higher IQ than you do, I suspect. I went to law school on a full academic scholarship, the only one in my class to have a full academic scholarship.
Well, that wasn't quite right either. Biden was on a half scholarship, and it was a hardship scholarship, not an academic one. He also claimed to have been a top student when, in fact, he'd finished towards the bottom of his class. It turned out it was a member of a rival candidate, Mike Dukakis's campaign, that tipped off the press about the Kinnock speech and gave them the tapes. The controversy wasn't going away, and Biden dropped out of the race. His heart wasn't in it anymore, and besides, he was getting these terrible headaches. Weeks later, he suffered a brain aneurysm and very nearly died. He recovered, 2 decades passed, and Joe Biden stayed in the Senate and in the public eye.
Professor, do you swear to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
In 2007, Biden was back on the presidential campaign trail, but he dropped out after a poor showing in the Iowa caucuses. His hopes of winning the White House finally seemed over, but then Democratic nominee Barack Obama tapped Biden to be his running mate.
Joe Biden!
It was a bit of a gamble for Obama. Biden's reputation as a wise head on foreign affairs was well established, but so was his reputation as something of a gaffe machine.
You cannot go to a 7-Eleven or a Dunkin' Donuts unless you have a slight Indian accent.
Then there was the time that he gave a shout out to Missouri State Senator Chuck Graham.
Chuck, stand up, Chuck, let him see you.
Turns out Chuck couldn't stand up. He's a paraplegic.
Oh, God love you. What am I talking about?
What indeed? But during his 8 years as vice president, Biden actually proved himself to be a valued second in command, and his gaffes started to seem more endearing than damaging, to some at least, like when a hot mic picked up an F-bomb after the signing of the historic Affordable Care Act. As the end of Barack Obama's presidency approached, Biden stayed on the sidelines, waiting to see if any of the controversies around frontrunner Hillary Clinton may create an opening in 2016 for another Biden White House run.
Any chance you're going to challenge her?
Yes, there's a chance. But I haven't made my mind up about that.
One of the reasons for Biden's indecision, his son Beau, who'd survived that 1972 car crash and served in the war in Iraq and as Attorney General of Delaware, now had brain cancer. He died in May 2015 at the age of 46, but not before urging his dad to wage another presidential campaign.
May God bless his memory and the lives of all he touched.
A grieving Vice President Biden decided not to run in 2016, and now, after almost half a century on the political stage, Biden is trying to make one last personal and political comeback and become the oldest person ever elected president. Well, for more on the likely Biden campaign for president, we're joined by Neera Tanden. She's a top Democratic Party advisor, working for presidential candidates back to Mike Dukakis in 1988 and most recently for Hillary Clinton. She also had her emails to Clinton campaign chair John Podesta hacked by Russia and published by Wikileaks in 2016. Neera Tanden, welcome back to Planet America.
It's so great to be with you.
We've learned a lot more about what went on in 2016 in the time since then. What's your view? Was Assange a knowing and willing accomplice of the Russians' interference campaign?
We just recently had the Barr summary of the Mueller report, and so obviously we need to see the entire Mueller report, which is a special counsel's report on his work over the last couple of years to determine Russia's actions. But in the Barr report itself, it said that Russia had acted vis-a-vis the hacks, had stolen emails from the Hillary Clinton campaign and had stolen emails through the DNC. So that much we know. Whether Assange was an agent of the Russians or had no idea I find it really hard to believe he did not know his intermediary were Russian actors, but hopefully he will speak out about this, and we will finally have some answers.
President Trump often said how much he loved WikiLeaks during the 2016 campaign. How confident are you now that his Justice Department will pursue other charges over 2016 as well as the 2010 Chelsea Manning hack?
Well, I have very little confidence in the Trump Department of Justice. I think the Attorney General has displayed a series of actions that are essentially running cover for the Trump White House. But there are a lot of machinations at the Department of Justice, and I imagine there are people who would like to see justice served. Again, the indictment is really about actions related to the 2010 hack more than, or I should say, stolen emails. But we'll see what comes in the days to come.
Let's turn to the 2020 election cycle. What do you make of these claims against Joe Biden, the inappropriate touching? Polls are showing it hasn't had much of an impact. Does that mean it's just no big deal?
I think that the Democratic electorate is actually relatively sophisticated, and they understand that their role is to pick a nominee that can go up against Donald Trump. And indeed, if you look at public opinion polling of the Democratic electorate, they are much more interested in finding a candidate that can beat Donald Trump than finding a candidate that agrees with them on every issue or one that is without criticism. Obviously, the Vice President himself said last week that he's learned a lot from this conversation, this public conversation, that he will change his behavior. But I also think plenty of Democrats look at the Vice President and his conduct and compare it to Donald Trump's and his conduct, and see the Vice President Biden, as really head and shoulders above Donald Trump's actions. And I think that's legitimate. I think ultimately the general election will be between two people. It will be a robust Democratic primary. There are a lot of fantastic candidates in addition to the Vice President. So I expect that this will be, will be a long primary, but I don't think any single action by a candidate will be determinative or destructive of their chances.
You know, of course, from many campaigns you've worked on, that narratives can form and take on a life of their own. Does this, on top of things like his handling of the Anita Hill hearing in 1991, is that going to create a problem for Joe Biden, especially with female voters?
Well, I think that the Vice President, when he runs, or if he runs, will have to answer those questions. This is a highly transparent time. Candidates have to talk to reporters regularly. They have to deal with reporters. They have to deal with the public. Most of the candidates are doing town halls. So I think voters will have legitimate questions about what happened during Anita Hill, and I think the Vice President will have to answer that. But I will say, I think that the times have changed with the candidacy of Donald Trump, and I think Democrats are a little bit more understanding of past positions. Something that happened almost 20 years ago will be viewed differently than something that happened in the last year. Now, the Anita Hill hearings were a searing event for a lot of people. They were a searing event for me. I was in college at the time, and I still remember them vividly. So I expect that this will be a robust conversation. But again, I do think that most Democrats in the United States and most progressive voters are actually measuring any one of these candidates vis-a-vis Donald Trump, and are looking for candidates who they agree with on a whole range of issues, but perhaps not every single issue.
Democrats have assembled a historically diverse field, and yet right now you look at the polls, it's two old white guys at the top. What does that tell you?
Well, it's very early. I worked on Hillary Clinton's campaign way back in 2007, now many, many years ago. And in the early goings of that race, she was far ahead of Barack Obama, and ultimately he won the primary. So these polls, I think, are reflecting to a fair degree of voter identification. Now, both Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden have a lot of support. But I do think that candidates during the debate process and ultimately in Iowa, New Hampshire, and many of the early states will be judged by how they look up against Donald Trump. During the debates, I think this will be really an almost subconscious question to people. And whether the party wants to go with an established figure who they know and know well, or one of the younger candidates who can perhaps demonstrate change, I think will be an open question.
Neera Tanden, thanks for being with us.
Oh, it's great to be with you.
When Hugo Chavez won the 1998 Venezuelan presidential election, things changed in Venezuela in a big way.
He used these powers in order to slowly but surely start dismantling democratic institutions from within.
That's Juan Carlos Hidalgo, a conservative policy analyst. He doesn't like Chavez very much.
While he was in power, he received over $1 trillion in oil revenues, and he used this money in order to pay for social programs that were very popular.
Free housing programs, free health care, even basically free food distribution programs.
That's Max Blumenthal, a lefty independent journalist. He's a little more into Chavez.
Chavez, what he represented was the democratization of Venezuelan society to include a sector of society, the darker-skinned, poorer majority that had been totally excluded, not only economically, but excluded from professions like journalism.
Chavez had his ups and downs, including an attempted coup against him in 2002, which America may or may not have been involved in, but the CIA definitely knew about the coup before it happened. And the Venezuelans haven't forgotten about it. Another downer for Chavez came in 2013, when he died, and he was replaced by his hand-picked successor, Nicolas Maduro, who's experienced a lot more downs than ups. You see, Venezuela has relied on oil for a long time. By 2014, more than 90% of the country's export earnings came from oil, which is fine when the price of oil was high, but then when this happened, Maduro had some revenue problems. And his solution was to print more money. A lot more money, which did not have the desired result.
The economy was dilapidated. It was decimated during Chavez's tenure. Now, he was receiving a lot of money in oil, and this masked the effects of the economy going to the ground. However, once the price of oil collapsed in 2014, the disaster became apparent. That's when we start seeing hyperinflation taking root in Venezuela.
But on the other hand,
you also have sanctions come into force in 2015 under the watch of Barack Obama, declaring Venezuela implausibly and bizarrely as a national security threat, which made it difficult for Venezuela to get loans, put pressure on multinational corporations and financial institutions to pull out of Venezuela, and made it difficult for the country to reverse the course of hyperinflation.
There is nothing true at all to the narrative that Venezuela's plight has to do with economic sanctions.
Juan Carlos disagreed.
It's exclusively economic mismanagement.
But everyone agrees that what came next was a disaster. Despite having the largest known oil reserves in the world, Venezuela's oil production dropped off as well, right there. Sanctions may have played a role in that, but so did 2 decades of ploughing Venezuela's wealth into social programs, but not into capital reinvestment in the oil industry. And this was a problem because export money is critical to Venezuela, since it imports 80 to 90% of all its goods, including food and medicine. So Maduro printed more money. And then when things looked really dire in 2017, America imposed even more sanctions. Venezuela was in trouble. With 3 years in a row of about minus 15% growth, the contraction was worse than during America's Great Depression. By 2017, imports, with all Venezuela's goods, had dropped 75% from 2013. 87% of families were now below the poverty line. The minimum wage barely paid for 12% of a single person's food needs, and the country lacked 80% of their basic medical supplies. And as for inflation, this is what happened to the price of coffee during 2018. We're talking about 80,000% inflation. On the other hand, the good news was that Trump's sanctions drove Maduro's approval rating from 17% all the way up to 23%. It was in that context that the 2018 presidential election was held. But there was one problem.
In 2018, most of the opposition parties were banned from contesting the election.
Well, at least two of Maduro's strongest rivals were indeed barred from running. And in the case of one of them, Leopoldo Lopez, his prosecutor later told Human Rights Watch that the trial had been a farce. The prosecutor said Lopez had been convicted of arson when there was no fire. They didn't even present evidence for a second charge of incitement of violence, but he was convicted anyway. For a third conviction of incitement, the prosecutors had alleged that Lopez had used subliminal messages, but he was still convicted. And the prosecutor was told that the order to ensure a long sentence for Lopez came directly from President Maduro himself.
The question is, was this election the representation of the popular will of the Venezuelan people? And Maduro won 6.3 million votes against an opposition that largely decided to boycott in conjunction with the US in order to delegitimize the election process itself.
It was a total sham.
Which takes us to January, when a desperately unpopular Maduro was re-sworn in and Juan Guaido popped up. Guaido was holding the presidency of the Venezuelan National Assembly at the time on a rotating basis, and he pointed to the Venezuelan constitution, which says that when the president-elect is absolutely absent, like say if the election is illegitimate, then a new election will take place, and the interim president shall be the president of the National Assembly. So Guaido declared himself president, even though a whopping 81% of Venezuelans had no idea who he was. But Maduro supporters knew enough to be sus. Firstly, Guaido was supported by the lighter-skinned minority that Chavez defeated back in 1998. Next, there were all kinds of stories about him.
Juan Guaido was part of what's known as Generación 2007, Generation 2000. These were a group of right-wing youth activists who were trained by a group.
Admittedly, those stories are quite long.
And according to one former member, the CIA itself.
Look, this goes on for a while. Watch the full interview on Facebook if you're interested. The suggestion is Guaido's linked to America, which may or may not be true, but Maduro supporters are paranoid about the possibility because of that attempted coup against Chavez back in 2002. And America certainly acted sus by warning Spain about what Juan Guaido was going to do before he did it. Then there was John Bolton talking openly about how great Venezuela's oil was going to be for America.
It'll make a big difference to the United States economically if we could have American oil companies really invest in and produce the oil capabilities in Venezuela.
Before Juan Guaido came right out and said he wanted private companies to play a bigger role in Venezuela's oil fields. Juan Carlos has a different view about Juan Guaido.
He has managed something that until very recently was thought to be impossible, which is unify the opposition. He has the backing of most Latin American governments. He has the backing of the United States, of Canada, Australia, the European Union.
He does have a lot of support, although so does Maduro. The question is, why would Donald Trump be so interested in Venezuela? Apart from his history with Miss Venezuelas, of course.
I think that he has a genuine interest in seeing Maduro gone. There is also a lot of work being done by Marco Rubio, the senator from Florida.
Yes, Rubio's been doing work for some time, performing such useful tasks as comparing Maduro to the now dead dictator Gaddafi, which many took as a threat. And Rubio showcased just how much he knows about Venezuela when he informed people about a transformer explosion at the German dam, only to be told that the transformer did not explode in a dam or anywhere German, but instead the reporter's name was German Dam. And yet Rubio seems to be the brains of the operation. So they've now tightened sanctions again, cutting oil exports in half again, potentially on their way to zero. And remember, that's how Venezuelans pay for food.
Sanctions are being used directly and intentionally to deprive Venezuelan people, regardless of their political affiliation, of food and medicine in a country that imports over 70% of its food supply. It is financial terrorism.
Although when Max himself visited Venezuela last month, he found the issue wasn't food scarcity, it was price.
Pet food is here. This one costs 66,000 bolivars, which is over $20 That's the problem here. The problem isn't scarcity. The problem is inflation and speculation. I expected to see stores without food, restaurants that were empty and had no food, streets that were empty because we constantly hear about this outpouring of refugees. And I saw a functional society and a city that did have food available, including at supermarkets where I could find pretty much everything I get in the United States. I did find an economic crisis, but the humanitarian crisis was nowhere to be found.
Nevertheless, people are out on the street, with both sides holding massive protest rallies.
But I'd like to point out the irony of this.
Go for it,
because we constantly hear that Maduro is this brutal, strong-armed communist dictator, but here he is allowing this opposition figure, who has been appointed by the US essentially as an interim president, to stir people up to remove him in a destabilization plot, someone who's been supported by a foreign power for years, and he has not been arrested. So what kind of communist dictator would do this?
Juan Carlos?
Unfortunately, if you look at the history of dictatorial regimes in recent decades, you will see that it's very unlikely that peaceful protests by themselves do the job of dislodging a dictatorship. So they know that they can allow these protests because they don't have any effect. These are very skillful people.
Okay, this segment has gone on for 11 minutes. How did this all end?
My concern is that we're going to reach a point where the Venezuelan people are going to lose the excitement that Juan Guaidó brought in January, and they are going to lose the hope, and they're just going to resign themselves to living under a dictatorship. Many of them are just leaving. They don't want to stay, and that's playing into the regime's hands.
And Max?
I think the government would want a peaceful way out. The moderate opposition wants a peaceful way out, but it's people like Juan Guaidó and his party, which the US have backed since its inception, that are hogging the cameras. You know, Venezuelans, what they really want is the same thing everyone else wants, which is stability, the ability to have jobs and have a decent salary. And right now, they don't have it, and they're blaming a variety of sources, not just their own government.
Ah, well, at least we can all agree on, well, Marco Rubio made a goose of himself, didn't he? Yes, he did.
And look at that, Chaz, we are right out of time, not just for this week, but for the next couple of weeks. We're taking a break over the Easter period and Anzac Day as well. We're back on the air on the 3rd of May.
But you'll find past shows, extra articles and longer interviews, lots from today, on Facebook there, as well as some stuff on iView and YouTube.
Yeah, we're not going to leave town entirely, though, because with the likely release of the Mueller report, we'll be covering that for ABC News. But until then, bye-bye.
See you later. Happy Easter.